Up first for our after lunch session, we have Amanda Healey from STEMbolt. She is living proof that when Clark says we're terrible at design, he is now wrong. We were terrible at design, but Amanda's done a lot of great work for organizing this conference. Any of the printed materials that you've seen, from your badges to the conference programs to any of the things that are posted up around the conference area, were all designed and done by Amanda. The conference site was done by Amanda, along with some help from the team at STEMbolt. So she's done some great work, and she's here to tell us about user experience and how it applies to Solidus. So please give a warm welcome to Amanda Healey.
Hey. So like Gregor said, I was hired about 6 months ago at STEMbolt as a UX designer. It was kind of like, it wasn't the typical interview, but they went over a lot of the things that they did. You know, it's technical. We have clients, it's e-commerce, but they didn't really get to show me the Solidus admin until after I signed the contract. So kind of since signing that contract, I've heard a couple of developers in the office say things like, oh, that's design. I don't touch design. I don't know anything about design. I don't have a design opinion. And I don't really think that's entirely true. So the goal of this talk isn't to make all of you guys into designers, but I am going to teach you kind of a new tool called design thinking that's going to help you approach your problems a little bit differently and hopefully come up with different solutions. I'd like to kind of take us through the Solidus admin so that we can see how we can actually break that down and use that in the next 45 minutes. I want to kind of dispel the myth that UX designers are the only people that are responsible for user experience. We all touch the product. We're all responsible for trying to get those users to convert into an actual paying customer, right? So before we jump into the admin, I kind of want to go over a few things what UX designers do, because I hear a lot of different, like, what's your role? What's your job title? Are you a UI designer or a UX designer? I don't really want to get into kind of roles, but I do want to go over some of the responsibilities. Oh, actually, the first thing that I want to do is say, why do we need designers in the world? Does anybody know why we need designers? Any idea? No idea. Who tried to come in these doors at all the last couple of days? Has anybody used the doors? Yeah. More than that has used the doors here. So this is called a Norman door. This is a door where the design tells you to do something that's the opposite of what you're actually supposed to do. A Norman door can also be a door that has a sign on it that says push or pull. Like, these are doors, so you shouldn't need an instruction manual to use a door, right? So this is why we need designers, because it looks really pretty. It's even functional. People are using it, but it should be intuitive. It should be something that somebody can just walk up to, use, and not even have to think about it. So we kind of, it's kind of a technical term for the design side of things, but it's called cognitive load, and we're always kind of trying to reduce the cognitive load and increase the flow that a user has through a system. And it could be doors, it could be a technical application. It's just kind of through life, we're trying to keep that flow. So one of the things that designers are trying to do all of the time is to create value. That's kind of the primary goal, and when we think about value, we don't always necessarily know where it comes from, but there's actually 6 different things that kind of break down and create a product of value. And this isn't, again, necessarily for digital, this is for everything. The big thing that people kind of think about, the desirability, that's a lot of the visual, the branding. It's creating an emotional attachment to something. Accessibility, that's not just for color blindness. I know a lot of people kind of think that that's what it is. It's also kind of knowing your audience and using the right terminology when you're talking to them. You're not going to use a lot of lingo that they don't know. Even just aging eyes, just because we can't read 10-point anymore, like, that doesn't mean that we're colorblind or that there needs to be a lot of consideration taken there, but just kind of bumping up that font size. And we've seen that over the last couple of years, you know, where 11-point kind of used to be default on websites, but we're seeing more and more that has larger fonts because it's just easier to read. It's better for everybody. Credibility is a super important thing with e-commerce. We want to make sure that we're kind of instilling trust in the people that are using our systems, both on the back end and also the kind of the users and the customers that are using the front side. Findability is a big thing. Sites need to be easy to navigate, right? Like people need to be able to search and they need to be able to browse to find the things that they're looking for. Usability is the big thing that I think people generally think about when they think of user experience, because it has the word usable in it, and it's just, is something easy to use? Is it efficient? Is it intuitive? The one thing that I think a lot of people kind of miss out on is the useful one. So useful is, okay, it's pretty, it's functional, everything looks great, like the business requirements are met, but is there actually a user for it? Like, is there actually a use case for it? Like, we've all seen all kinds of pretty to-do apps out there, but how many more to-do apps do we need, right? So the thing with UX is that, like a lot of other jobs out there, it's, you know that you're doing a good job when nobody notices. So people are going to complain when you do a bad job, but at the end of the day, you kind of just want people to go through and not notice the thing that they just kind of interacted with. So kind of back to that list of responsibilities that a UX designer does. Oops, sorry. There's all kinds of different job titles, different roles that a UX designer might do. Some of them, like me, that might be a little bit more of a generalist. They might kind of do all of these things. Or you might find people that are more into the visual design of things, or more into user research and validation, or content management. The one thing that I do want to note about all of these is that if you're calling yourself a user experience designer or anything with user in it, if you're not actually talking to users, you're lying. I'm just going to say that flat out. And if anybody wants to have a conversation about that later, I'll be around. In addition to kind of all these responsibilities that designers do, there's also three things that we're always trying to balance, and that's the stakeholder needs. So there's users that we need to account for, there's technology requirements, and then there's also the business requirements. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that they're all balanced and everybody's kind of happy they're going away with their own piece of the pie, right? Nobody should ever be taking the whole pie. You need to share your pie. So the one thing, the overarching thing about all of the people that do these kinds of roles is the way that they think. And the way that they think is something that I call design thinking. There's some other people out there that call it design thinking. Since I think the 60s or the 70s has kind of been a term that's being used. And it's just a different way of looking at a problem. So critical thinkers they break down ideas, right? It's like, I really want to understand this. I want to break it down from every angle. I want to see it. How does this thing work? Design thinkers kind of start with a goal instead of a problem to solve. So it's like, at the goal, like, we want to get the user over to this point in the admin. Like, how are we going to do that? And then we come up with all kinds of ideas on how we're going to do that. We're going to brainstorm. We're just going to keep coming up with more and more things. So it's kind of a building up thing instead of a breaking down thing like critical thinking is. And I don't mean to say that you guys probably aren't design thinkers. You might not even know that you're a design thinker. A good real life example of this is if you have ever planned a vacation. You probably didn't pick the first one in the book or the first one at kind of the travel agent that you walked into, right? Like, you sat down, you started brainstorming some things. You're like, oh, now that I know what's out there, I really want to find a sunny place. So then you narrow down a little bit, but then you brainstorm again. And you kind of narrow down and brainstorm and narrow down and brainstorm. And you could come up with a city and a country that you never would have expected to visit. But if you would have just kind of taken the first option that you saw, you might not have ever ended up there. So now that we kind of have an understanding of what designers do and kind of like the design thinking mental model, I want to lead us through kind of a Solidus admin exercise and see how we can break down a simple goal there. So there's 4 steps that we're going to use, and this it relates a little bit to the last talk that we saw. You'll kind of see that there's a little bit of overlap in here. The first phase is definition, and this is where you want to be really specific with your goal and really specific with your user. The planning phase is next. This is going to cover a couple of different steps in here. It's a really important phase that you want to make sure that you don't skip. The third phase is build. This is the one that we're all kind of super familiar with, right? Like, when you talk to somebody that you meet on the street, your friends, your parents, you're like, I'm a programmer, or I'm a designer. Like, that's the thing that we identify with. But if we don't do the definition and the planning, and then the validation phase after that, the build phase isn't going to be nearly as good as it can be. And validation can also be called testing. I just want to make sure that you don't confuse it with QA or UAT or any kind of scripted tests. This is where we actually go when we validate that we met the user's goals. So that means that we use users again for a second time to make sure that we're giving them what they actually need. So like Clark mentioned yesterday, the goal here isn't to keep getting, the goal here is to keep getting better. Like, we're never going to be perfect, but if you just keep striving to make things better, everybody's going to be better off at the end of the day. So with the first step being define, I want to break that down into the 3 different things that you want to define here. So there's business needs, like we want to be able to give our employees the tools that they need to do the best job they can, right? Like the business needs are kind of, we'll get into that in a minute. The user is just exactly like, who are they? Like, what's a little bit of background on them? Sometimes we develop personas to kind of get an idea of who our people are. You want to see what their experience is like with it. It's not just I want to get from point A to point B. Like, what does it feel like? You want to get that emotion out there. The empathy, I think that was mentioned earlier too. And then the most important part, not most important part, but important part here is just kind of having the metrics to validate it, right? I think a lot of the time we don't necessarily start with a good goal or a good user or even good metrics, but we're trying to do something. We're like, hey, I ran that A/B test, and now I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this information because nothing really came out of it. So if we're really clear in defining all of these things, we're going to come out at the other end having a better idea of what it is that we need to do going forward. So for business needs, we don't necessarily have some business needs here for the case study today, but there's 3 that are kind of always in the back of my head of what the business likes. They like to make more money, obviously. Everybody likes to make more money. They always like to, some of them like to increase brand awareness, because once you establish your brand, then you kind of establish your place in the marketplace. So that's always a good place to be. And then if you're really lucky, you work for, you work for a place like Stembold, where they like to keep their employees happy. So if we kind of keep those 3 things in mind as you're just kind of going through all of these steps, it just helps to know where the business is coming from, right? Make better decisions. In terms of user stories, we don't always necessarily have a specific user to talk to, but if you just kind of start paying attention to what's going on in the office around you, and when you talk to your clients, you might get some ideas of user stories that you could come up with that aren't necessarily business problems to solve. So the example that I'm going to give here is that you might just be hanging out in the hallway one day and you hear somebody saying, hey, I'm super excited, like we just found a new supplier for our t-shirts. We got a better price on it. We're going to have to, they're a little bit heavier because it's a better quality. I'm super pumped about this. We're going to have to go update that in the Solidus admin. Like, that's a totally valid idea that you could take and you could improve that flow. Like, there's not a problem there per se. Everybody has been using the Solidus admin and putting in products and updating products since it was spree, and everything works fine there. But there's a couple of opportunities that we can kind of work on to make that better. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to define the user. So a lot of the times we think about the admin users that use the admin, but there's actually a lot of different kinds of users that use the admin, right? Like, you've got the marketing people, the customer service people, there might be some business analysts that just go in and download reports once a month. So there's all different kinds of people that are in there using it in different ways, and it helps to be cognitive of how they're using it and what pieces they're touching. The second piece that you want to do is kind of really break down and define the goal. So the user is saying, you've overheard this conversation in the hallway, and they're talking about that they have all these shirts and they're going to want to update these cool things. Well, what are those things, right? Like, we want to update the product price, the details, and the images on all of the new shirts. So if you write that, you start to write down this, like, you see the user story develop as we go through this. And then the third part is, why are we doing this? And sometimes this is obvious and you don't write it down, but then you kind of forget later on. So it helps to be obvious and write it out so that it matches what's in the warehouse, because obviously you just want everything to kind of be, single source of truth and the same. And then at the last part is that validation metrics part. And this always gets a little bit tricky, because sometimes you don't have a quantifiable metric. Sometimes it's just making somebody happier, and like, how do you measure happiness? And we can get into that a little bit later, but in this case, it's with as little effort as possible. So yeah, the quantitative is kind of, when we're talking about metrics and how we're going to measure this, it can be like you want a user to complete a task faster. So right now it takes 45 seconds to do this thing, and I want to cut it down to 30 seconds. That's totally valid. Or it could be increased conversions. Like right now we're at 10%, and by the end of the year we want to be at 15%. I'm kind of an emotional, touchy-feely person, so I like the qualitative stuff. I like talking to users and saying, hey, like your site's is so better, like it's improved so much. I've gotten so many referral codes given out to other people that I've gotten $100 worth of free merch. And you can see that those codes are getting redeemed, but like when you start talking to people and you get a sense of the community, I think that's when things really start to make a difference, is when you talk to the people like people and not just like users, right? Like we're all humans and we have human needs. So after we've kind of defined the goal, we've got the metrics in there, we want to go into the planning phase. So this is the second phase out of the 4, and it gets a little bit, there's a lot of stuff that goes on here. So there's 5 different things that planning kind of takes part of. You've got your research, your brainstorming, prototyping to kind of figure out how all of the details work. You got to compare that, and you've got to choose a solution. So I think this is what we kind of saw before lunch. So when we hit the research phase, basically what I do here is I just start asking all kinds of questions. So like, what does the user flow like when they're updating an existing product? Where does the user start if they want to make product updates? How do they find the products that they want to update? What needs to happen for the user to actually be able to edit the price and the details and the images there? How does that data that they just entered, how does it get saved? You know, we said that there's a whole bunch of products, a whole bunch of t-shirts that need to be updated here, so how is the user kind of navigating back and forth between all of those? We would ask more questions than that, but for the purpose of this talk, we're just going to kind of ask those 5 or 6. But I encourage you, when you're doing this on your own, to kind of go through, and if you can come up with 100 questions, that's awesome, because you kind of get rid of the low-hanging fruit at the beginning, and then you get into the real nitty-gritty stuff at the end. The second thing that you kind of want to cover when you're doing your research is constraints. So right now the Solidus admin exists. We're not building anything net new. And for anybody that's familiar with the product section, like there's 3 kind of tasks that users already do here. They create new products, they edit existing ones, or they just kind of view them in a list so that they can see what they've got on hand. There's also some conventions that are probably already established in this admin. We know what the color scheme looks like. We know how you move through the pages. So if we start with some of those questions that we just came up with, we keep the constraints in mind. We move on to kind of the questions. The first question that we were asking is, what is the user flow? What's the start point that they're kind of hanging out at when they come into the admin? So this is a pretty easy one to answer. The flow is just kind of 4 steps up here. It doesn't really trigger a need to say, hey, we need to investigate further, but it is a good thing to just kind of know. So you kind of put that in the back of your mind, and you're like, okay, this is going to be information that's useful going forward. The second question is, where does the user find the products for editing? At first glance, using your critical thinking skills, you might be like, duh, they're right there on the screen. But then when you start thinking about, kind of building up of ideas, you're like, there's more things on the screen that need to be on the screen, right? So this is one of those things where you're like, okay, there's more things that need to be there. Maybe this is something that I can kind of brainstorm about a little bit more. So we take that and we put that on a list. That's like, this is like the to-do list that we're going to kind of go through the rest of the steps on. The third question that we asked was, how is the user going to edit a product? There's 2 different ways currently that the user can edit the product. There's one, there's an icon button, or they can also click on the product name. This is kind of one of those places, again, where you're going to want to ask yourself more questions, like, well, why is there 2 reasons? Like, is there any difference between the 2? Is one easier to find? Is one easier to use? Is one easier to understand even? So this is one of those things that I might have a little bit of a leg up on you guys than what you know, because I have some experience in user experience design, that there's probably some increased cognitive load because there's two options and they don't kind of fit well together. So it's kind of hard to tell what's going to happen if it's bad or if it's good. So we need to do a little bit more user testing. This is one of those things where we could hit our heads on the table all day, but we're not going to come up with a solution because we don't fully understand the problem or if there even is a problem. So this is a thing that I would kind of put on a list for later. It's on your backlog. It's like, this is what we're going to investigate when we have time to get some users together, or maybe it's like even taking some of your marketing department or what have you at your company, if you're lucky enough to work for an internal team, out for drinks. And you just kind of like ask them some questions about how they're using stuff. If you can pull it up on a computer, you can watch them. That's even better. So this kind of goes like just kind of off to the side, and we're not going to deal with this one too much. The next question is, where is the price and the details and the images? Because if those are the things the user needs to update, how are they going to find them? Again, they're on two different pages. This isn't necessarily a problem, but it might be. In my experience, what I have seen is that kind of light users of a system like to see things broken down neatly and not too much. They don't want to be overwhelmed with a lot of stuff on the page, so they like different pages, different tabs. If you've used the Solidus admin, you know that it's a little bit slow. Super users or power users that are in there all the time don't seem to get overwhelmed as easily. They want to see all the information. They want to be able to scroll and compare and like look back and forth. So this might be a problem, it might not be a problem, but it's just kind of a trigger point of this is something that I want to investigate further down the line when we have some users, right? So you kind of add that to the list and you move on to the next question. This is an easy one and a hard one all at the same time. How to save, you click on the save button, right? But again, it starts asking, or you start thinking about more questions that you want to ask. So where is the save button? The information that the user needs to put in here, in the details and the price and the images, it's all at the top of the page. There's no save button up there. You need to know to scroll. You can figure out pretty quickly that you need to scroll to find a save button. And because the users in here are repeat users, like they would figure that out pretty quick. But it's just one more of those cognitive load things that you just kind of want to reduce, right? So this goes on the brainstorming list. So that was, so we've got two things on the brainstorming list and two things on the investigation list for later at this point. So the last thing that we want to look at is how to navigate between the products. And again, this is where we kind of go back to the constraints and conventions of what the app is already behaving like. And we know that this back to products list button in the top right-hand corner, it isn't consistently used throughout the admin. It's a great idea, but we're not consistent with it, and we're not actually using the button convention properly, because generally in web convention, you want to do your navigation as links. It doesn't need to be as prominent on the screen, and your buttons are kind of more call to action things. Action things like submitting a form or saving a page. Sometimes there's some visual design things that you want to do there to kind of give priority to one or the other, but in general, that's kind of the convention that we use. So again, this is something that I think that we can solve. So it goes onto the brainstorm list. One that was super easy, the flow. Two need further investigation, that's going on the backlog. And then the three that we're going to take to the next phase is where to find the products, how to save them, and how we're navigating back and forth between the products. So the second step in the planning phase is brainstorming. So we want to, these are the three questions that we just looked at, but already we're kind of starting to narrow down what exactly it is that we're looking for. So we're going to reword the questions to kind of, to make our thinking kind of go along those routes. So identify and display a group of products. Like now we're saying, we're kind of getting a little bit more technical here, where the user just doesn't need to find the products. Like what we really need to do as a developer is identify what those products are and then display them. Easy to find and save is pretty much the same. The navigation thing, it needs to be consistent and it needs to be helpful. So so now that we've kind of got that established, we moved to kind of breaking them down one by one. So if we're identifying and displaying a specific group of products, we're trying to brainstorm up some ideas on how we could do this. There's two parts here. There's the identification and the displaying. So identifying, there's a couple of different options. We could get the user to manually move everything that they wanted into the list. Like they could just it's a one-time setup. Maybe it takes a long time, but they just go in, they put everything in the order that they're always going to want to see it in. We could also use taxons because that's a handy way that we're already using to organize our products. So that's another option that we could use. Or we could come up with something totally brand new like categories, right? It would just be a new piece of metadata that we're going to attach to our product variants. For the interaction options, we've got a couple of things that are already in the page. We've got the search field that's at the top, and it has filtering capabilities already built in. We've also got the table that has some sorting capabilities. Some of the name column there has the little arrows so that you can sort it alphabetical or reverse alphabetical. So once we kind of have or we could also have a new interaction model. This is where you would generally kind of go in and you'd start to brainstorm on the interaction models, but for the case of this, we're just going to kind of put that there to keep things simple. So after you kind of have a list of your brainstorm of all of these things that we could do here to solve this, that's when you kind of want to go and prototype. And when I say prototype, I don't necessarily mean go to code. I mean, just work it out. What is this thing going to look like? You can do it a sketch on a napkin, and maybe that's enough to make a decision. Sometimes you can do a screen cap, like for the taxons. Other times, maybe it's a wireframe or a mock-up. You take it to the mall, and you're like, what product do you want to buy? Even though it's the same product, you have two different site designs. That's going to kind of give you an idea before you have to make anything in code. It's super low fidelity, and it totally works. So I would encourage you to kind of try that out. So in this case, what made sense to me was that taxons, we totally leverage taxons, they're already there. Let's do that instead of coming up with something net new. And also because we have the search and the table functionality there already, let's kind of go with that. There's no need to make up anything new there either. Originally, I was liking the table solution the best. In general, I try to keep interactions and then the response of that interaction is kind of in the same spot. So if I want to sort my table data, I want to be able to do that in the table. I don't want to have to do it up here in the search form and then see stuff down in the table. So that's kind of one of those UX principles where you kind of try to localize the interactions to where the stuff is happening. But then the more I thought about it, searching is actually going to restrict what the user sees. So if we just sort the table, we're going to have the same problem that we currently do where there's too many products there and it's overwhelming, and I just want to streamline that. So search was totally a winner for me because that point just kind of blew everything else out of the water. So you want to take that. We've got all of this knowledge, we've got our brainstorm, we've kind of got the ideas of what we're going to do here, and we want to structure that in a way that we can just kind of slip it into our sprint tracker or backlog or whatever it is that we're using to track our work. And similar to the original goal that we had, we want to structure it so that you're saying what it is that you're doing and then why you're doing it. So you just throw that into your sprint tracker, whatever you have, and you kind of move on to the next one. So the second out of three that we wanted to look at is how do we make this thing easy to find and save? There's a couple of different options here. I mean, there's only one save button in the page, so we could duplicate it. We could put it throughout the page. There's one at the top, there's one at the bottom. Maybe if the page is really long, there's one in the middle. We could also make it sticky somewhere so that it's always visible, it's always reachable. Kind of like there's a back to top button when you have the table of content links that's the top of some websites. You could also have a send to bottom button. A colleague mentioned when I was going through this presentation the first time actually that what would be super awesome is if we had button states indicating the need to save. So I threw that in there too. We could also just kind of get rid of all of this save notion and we could just automatically save the page. So we take kind of all of these ideas again and we go and we prototype and we compare. So some of these things you don't even necessarily start to draw out, and you're like, this is ridiculous. Like putting a bunch of save buttons in the page, especially with the way it's styled right now with the lines, like there's just going to be lines and buttons everywhere. It's going to look ridiculous. With this two button thing, or two bottom button in the top right, it's, if you're going to click on a button, you might as well click on the right button. So the thing that really made sense here to me was that there's a sticky button and that we kind of implement those button states. So not only could we have a resting state, you know, the page does not need to be saved right now. It's just a regular looking button. Hey, like you want to save me right now. We could also put a progress indicator right in the button. Kind of like how I was talking earlier about localizing the interaction or what's happening into the page to where it's actually happening. So we want to take that and we want to write that in our goal-oriented solution way, again, for our tracker, with your what and your why, and then you just kind of slip that wherever you need to, and you can time estimate against it, or the developers can kind of start working on it right away. So the third guy that we're kind of going to look at here is consistent and helpful navigation. So right now, we've got that button at the top, and we've also got kind of the page title up there as well. We want to make sure that we're consistent across the application when we're doing this, but we also want to balance prominence and clutter. Like we want stuff to show up that is important, but we don't want to clutter the whole page with all of the important things. If we made everything on the page red because it was important, nothing would be important anymore, right? So what we could do is we could remove the back buttons in the header, right? And remember, like this is just the brainstorming phase, so anything goes, even if it seems wrong when you first throw it up there. We could add buttons to every page. And then we're like, wait a minute. We could also use this title over here, and we can make breadcrumbs, and we can make those links. Like, so when we kind of start to think about those three things, the first two don't make sense at all because we already said they're breaking convention. So there's only kind of like the third option that's left, create breadcrumbs that are also links. So we didn't even need to really draw this out or prototype too much because it's just, sometimes things are just a little bit more obvious. So we take that again, we write that in this way. In this case, we've actually kind of got a bonus win. There's two Y's here. So we want to create links so that users can navigate backwards. But if we actually start going into the title and we're making those breadcrumbs, we're also going to tell the user where they are. Because right now, a lot of the times when you're in the product section, you see products, maybe you see the product name, and you see if you're editing it or not. So like if we can kind of give the user a little bit more direction of like exactly where they are in there, then they're going to be able to navigate around better, and it just reduces that cognitive load again. So again, just to recap, I know this is a lot of information. We've got 3 things that are ready to build. We've got 2 that need more investigation. So when we get to the build phase, the first thing that we kind of wanted to talk about doing was adding a taxon field to the product search. And I mean, that's pretty straightforward. We just throw another field in there. There's lots of room in the grid that we've got now. And it's done. And then the last 2 that we kind of looked at, this is where you want to make sure that you're kind of thinking holistically and how do things work together. You don't want to design in a silo. So we've got the sticky save button that we wanted to put on all of the edit pages, and we also wanted to add the breadcrumb link. Well, what would be super awesome is if we're going to put something sticky on the page, like what else should be sticky? What else should we always tell the user? My idea here is that it's really good to tell the user where they are all of the time. So we can put that, all of a sudden, where to put that save button kind of becomes more apparent. Like there's no point in putting it in the footer because we've already kind of got this idea of putting that stickiness up in the top header. So after you've got it built, this is where you want to validate. This is where you want to test against the goal in the define stage. So you want to make sure that you defined it really well so that you can test against it really well. You want to make sure that this feature works with real users, right? And then you also want to iterate. Like you don't fail here. You just learn more and then you keep improving. There's a couple of different tools that you can use here. The best tool is just going and talking to actual users. If you're in the advantageous spot of actually having people that you work with that you can kind of go and see their workflow, like that's awesome. That's kind of the best option for the admins right now. You also, when you're doing that, you want to make sure that you're watching users and how they do stuff, and that they're not telling you what they think other users might do. Because so many times I've run usability tests where people are like, oh, this just must be me, everybody else would get this. And you're like, no. I don't want you to tell me what other people are doing, I just want to watch you do it. So you want to be able to kind of filter what people are saying versus what they're doing. When you're talking about front end, there's all kinds of tools out there, right? There's Google Analytics that you can use to track data. You can use Crazy Egg for heat maps, so you can see where users are clicking on your site. I know people don't necessarily like pop-ups, but I'm in the belief that people have kind of become desensitized to them a little bit, so they're not as in your face as they used to be. If you can catch a user when they're leaving your site, you're going to get some information from them that you might not have otherwise. So a lot of people aren't going to take the time to complain to your customer service representatives, but if you catch them when they've just had like a bad experience on your site and you can just ask them 2 or 3 quick questions when they're leaving, sometimes you can get some insights that you wouldn't have otherwise. You can also kind of collect those people that I call your super users. They're like the people that are going to sell your product for you. I bought 1 thing from you, and then I bought 7, and I gave them to all my friends, and then I promoted it to my whole family, and all of a sudden you just got 20 new sales from this one person that is an evangelist for your product. So the point that I really wanted to drive home today was that design thinking and critical thinking aren't necessarily 2 different skills, right? Like, these are 2 things that we should be using together. Hopefully I've given you a little bit of insight into how design thinking works, and you'll be a little bit more confident to kind of use it in your future projects. Like John was saying the other day, it would be great if we could get more people commenting even in GitHub. And if you're feeling up to it, if we could get you contributing back to core. So if you would like to talk more about this, because I can talk about this all day, you can reach me on Solidus Slack. I'm at Amanda. I'm on GitHub. I'm Mandalee, or you can email me at STEMbolts. Any questions? Yes?
I'm curious about a step even before getting into the UX research, or at least after defining some of the user stories, which is how you start prioritizing them, and looking at what's most important to investigate and what can wait until later.
Yeah.
I feel like especially in the admin, we probably have a lot of like customer service reps that have to deal with like order updates a lot, and refunds and things like that, and like what the percentages of people using that versus like adding new products, for example.
Yeah, so that's where you kind of want to, when you're prioritizing, you want to figure out the value of something, right? So like, it helps sometimes to kind of get a dev estimate against something and then see how important a user would rank that thing, or see how much trouble they're having with it. So opening the door every day, maybe it's not that big of a problem, but I have to do it every day 7 times a day, and it's going to be really quick to just take the handle off of that side. Like, that's a quick win, right? There might be something that's more complicated, like it would be really great if we installed escalators so it didn't have to deal with doors. That's a great user experience, but development-wise with the time estimate against that, like, it's just not doable at this point. So it's kind of like balancing how much it's affecting users, how much development time it's going to take, and sometimes what the business needs are, right? Like, sometimes it's like this quarter we're focusing on building brand. Like, I don't want to talk about anything other than just building our brand. So it's just kind of balancing all 3 of those. Yeah. Anybody else? I would like to mention that I'm going to be doing our birds of a feather on A/B testing. I heard a couple of people asking questions about that yesterday, so I thought that would be a good topic to kind of chat about.
Another one, what are some of the next steps on the roadmap in terms of like improving the UX on the admin side?
For the Solidus, there's so many things. There is a GitHub issue with some of that stuff in there. There's a lot of investigation going on right now. So the big thing that I'm super excited about is starting to take some of the interactions, like editing a product or adding a new thing when it's just a couple of fields. And right now they're in separate pages, is like in putting all of that in one page, right? There's a couple of places in there where you click edit and you can just do stuff in the table. So I'd like to kind of start putting stuff all in one screen, like when it's super simple interactions like that. We're also, Hawthorne, or John was alluding to this yesterday, like we've got Bootstrap in there now and we're fixing the grid. We need to figure out how forms are kind of, how we're going to do forms in that new grid and like make sure that they're responsive. So there's a lot of kind of structural work that we're doing right now. We just put tabs in, which is awesome. And when all of that structural work is kind of going to be done, that's when we're going to go and we're going to brand it. So it's going to look super nice, right? And then we're going to be able to make screenshots. We're going to be able to put it up on the website and we're going to be able to like sell it. So I'm super excited about all of those things. That's kind of what's coming up. Little tweaky things like making messaging more intuitive, error messaging, error handling. I don't know anything about the technical side, but just kind of from the content side, I want to get in there and make sure that everything's consistent. The same with labels and page titles. There's a couple of places where they don't align, so I just want to make everything kind of as simple and streamlined as possible. And any ideas that you guys have, just throw them at me. Cool. Thank you.